received from Deputy and Ferguson Centres Tony Mulcahy and Avena Batchik. The purpose of this meeting is to have an engagement from members of the Reserve Defence Forces Representative Association. A briefing has been circulated to members, and I wish to welcome Mr. Patrick Mully. You're very welcome, sir, again. Thank you. Mr. Neil Richardson, very welcome. Mr. Martin Cooney, very welcome. Mr. Owen Colgan, Mr. James Scanlon and Mr. Rob Gilby to this meeting today. You're all very welcome. Thanks for being here. The format is that we normally employ, that we find works very well, is that we invite you to make some opening remarks for about 5 minutes just to highlight the key points, and then we find the interaction, question and answer session after that to be most productive and interesting and worthwhile. Before we begin, I have to draw the attention of all witnesses to the situation in relation to privilege. Please note that by virtue of Section 172L of the Defamation Act 2009, you are protected by absolute privilege in respect of the evidence you are to give to the committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise nor make charges against any person, persons or entity by name, or in such way as to make him, her or it identifiable. Members should also be aware that under the stated rulings of the Chair, members should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the House or an official by name in such way as to make him or her identifiable. Mr. Mully, I think you're leading off, are you?
I'll just open it, and thank you for inviting us back, and thanks to the members who are in attendance here today. And we were here on the 24th of April 2013, and we were at that stage just bidding in the process of the reorganisation on the foot of the value for money report, which was completed on November 2012. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Martin Cooney to give us our opening remarks in that sequence.
Okay.
When last we addressed you here, we were in the middle of the reorganisation of the Reserve Defence Forces following the Value for Money review. And in our submission at that time, we touched on a number of items. We touched on gave a high-level overview of our issues with the Value for Money review. We indicated the value that the Reserve brings to the state, some of the civilian qualifications available in the Reserve, and we also indicated that we were seeking an independent review of the Reserve Defence Force. We also expressed an opinion at the time that there was a very real risk that because of the Value for Money review and the reorganisation of the Reserve Defence Forces, that the Reserve would seek to exist as an organisation in 2016. And the Value for Money review recommended that a further formal review be conducted after a period of 4 years with a view to examining the utility and capacity levels and the progress of the Reserve. And we're now at the halfway mark, so we think it's an opportune time to come back into you and to discuss what has actually transpired. We'd like to do this under 4 main pillars. The first one is the introduction of key performance indicators. The second is the structural conflict that exists between the Permanent Defence Force and the Reserve Defence Forces. Third item is recruitment, and the fourth is the package of support that the Reserve Defence Force requires. These areas can be explored in depth with my colleagues here afterwards in questioning, and I'd actually ask your indulgence at the end. I can give you the view of the Army Reserve, but I can't on the Naval Services Reserve, so if you'd indulge me, I'd invite my colleague Mr. Colgan after I finish to make some points in that regard. Whilst we've always objected to the premise for the latest reorganisation, we do have to commend the Defence Forces and how they've approached the task. As always, they've demonstrated that they are leaders in change management, so much so that the administrative order that was to change the Reserve Defence Forces was out the same month as the Value for Money review of the Reserve Defence Force was published. It's an extremely quick time frame. Now, it wasn't formalised until 2013, but this is the document that governed the restructuring of the Reserve Defence Forces and what was to happen thereafter. A core tenet of this administrative order is a concept known as the single force concept. And this entailed the disestablishment of Reserve Defence Force units, or Army Reserve units and Naval Service Reserve units, and the insertion of reserve elements into permanent units. And the theory behind that is that a single chain of command would allow for greater scope for collective training and operational effectiveness. That administrative instruction also sets out how the new Reserve Defence Force is to operate, and it identifies a number of key performance indicators against which Reserve Defence personnel will be evaluated. These are used to assess the individual effectiveness of members of the Reserve Defence Force, and they consist of a number of criteria which include paid and unpaid training, medical test, fitness test and annual personal weapon test. The concept of objective measurement criteria is welcomed within the Reserve. It's not something we're adverse to. It should serve as a true measure of the output of the organisation, and it also serves as a motivational aspect for individual reservists to seek to achieve and obtain. However, any such criteria must be realistic, it must be achievable, and adequate resources must be given to personnel in order to achieve them. Unfortunately, this has not been the case, and there are a number of issues with the key performance criteria that have been imposed on the Reserve Defence Force. These issues relate both to the criteria themselves and also the method in which they have been implemented. I won't go into the merits of the key performance indicators, but I would like to explore some of the issues that we've encountered when we've tried to achieve them. So, at the outset, the Reserve Defence Forces have been imposed upon permanent units. So immediately there is a mismatch between the working times and working hours of each element. Whilst the terms of service of the Permanent Defence Force is 24/7, in reality, the usual term or usual working hours outside of when Permanent Defence Force personnel are on operational duties or training are Monday to Friday, 9 to 4:30. The Reserve, on the other hand, the majority of the training is conducted in the evenings or at weekends in order to accommodate our civilian employment and our other obligations. So this presents an immediate problem in relation to the administration of the key performance indicators. For example, medical tests. If I have to undergo a medical test, it will be conducted by the medical corps who operate during normal working hours. The test consists of two parts. Part 1 on one day, part 2 on the next day. 2 days straight away. The next is my fitness test. Consists of 3 parts. Parts 1 and 2 on one day, parts 3 on another day. Another 2 days gone. So, and additionally, if the permanent unit conducts its annual range practice, where they test you on your weapon, on a weekday, I now have potentially used up 5 days of annual leave to satisfy administrative requirements. So that's essentially a reservist using up 25% of their annual statutory entitlement to leave on administrative matters. That's without taking into account the fact that we may be called up for full-time training. If we do one period of full-time training, you've now used up 50% of your annual leave. And if you try to do a career course, which is generally structured over 2 weeks, you've used up 75% of your statutory leave entitlement. So it's an absolutely ridiculous situation where you can't expect reservists to meet this. You cannot expect us to use up our annual leave on administrative tasks, and it's an unreasonable expectation, particularly where there is no legislation to protect reservists for doing so. In addition, we're being asked to meet these criteria without the same support that our permanent colleagues have. We're not entitled to the same medical care, we're not entitled to the same benefits, and we do not have the access to the facilities that they have. It's specifically set out in the administrative instruction that reservists will not be afforded the facilities or time to train for these key performance indicators during full-time training. So all responsibility lies with the reservists in their own time, and that's something that cannot be said for their permanent colleagues. When the next review is conducted, the cold figures will indicate that a certain percentage of reservists haven't met their key performance indicators. No investigation will be conducted into what happened or what actually occurred or the administrative obstacles or burdens that were put in reservists' way, nor will anything in relation to the personal time or sacrifice of reservists that was required to meet those criteria. Instead, the criteria will be used to denigrate reservists and to say that and it will completely ignore that the process was implemented in a way that was completely unworkable. What is particularly striking is that there are no similar key performance indicators for our permanent colleagues. The Reserve Defence Force is a training output of the Permanent Defence Force. Our standards should reflect on the input that the Permanent Defence Force has put into us. And when you assess the output of any service, surely it would make sense to assess the service provider. Yet again, the regime is set up to scrutinise the reservist, and we must stand up and be counted. And there is no similar situation for our permanent colleagues. Now, our permanent colleagues will say that they have training standards to meet each year, and that part of that will be what happened with the reserve. But this is a circular argument, because they will go back and use the key performance indicators of the reserve to see whether or not they've made their training output. And our fear is that, as happened in the last Value for Money report, questions will not be asked as to what our permanent colleagues did or did not do in respect to the reserve. Instead, it'll be a focus on the reserve failing to meet its objectives. When we fail, as is already predetermined, the true problems will be conveniently ignored. And reservists face eventual discharge for failing to meet their key performance indicators, but the same cannot be said for our permanent colleagues if they fail in their obligations to the reserve. I'd like to talk about the structural conflict between the Permanent Defence Force and the Reserve Defence Forces. Aside from the issues with key performance indicators, we have to contend with the difficulties of dealing with a full-time professional force where we are part-time professionals. There's absolutely no doubt in our mind that there is commitment to the Reserve Defence Force at the very highest levels in the Defence Forces. The General Staff have indicated that they're committed to make this work. But the addition of reserve elements to permanent units represents an additional workload to the existing workload with no incentive or reward in return. And we noted when we were here last time that the loss of the cadre staff was significant in terms of the loss of experience and the loss of knowledge. And it appeared to us that the reorganisation was being pushed through in a very tight time frame without adequate consideration for the differences that are inherent in both organisations. Now, many of our concerns have proven justified. The reorganisation was supposed to be implemented by 30th of March 2013, yet in 2014 we were still dealing with issues arising from the reorganisation. And as the reorganisation progressed, it was very evident that there were significant issues in the records and administration of the Reserve Defence Forces, and this impeded the smooth transition of the Reserve into the Permanent Defence Forces. On top of this, many of the cadre staff retired, and with them their knowledge and experience was lost. And permanent units were left to grapple with an administration system which they weren't familiar with and weren't trained on. And as a result, reservists have suffered in relation to delays on pay, restrictions on training, and denial of entitlements. Greater demands are being placed on reservists in respect of training during normal working hours so that they can train with their permanent colleagues. And by no means is this a criticism of the Permanent Defence Force. It would be unrealistic to expect someone to work all week and then come in the evenings and at the weekend for no extra incentive or reward. But the irony in this is that is exactly what reservists are expected to do. And we've gone to a situation where our rewards and incentives have been taken away, and the incentive is more stick than carrot at this point in time. Compounding this problem is that the military, legislative and administrative structure to govern the reorganised reserve has not been put in place. It's absolutely astounding that 20 months into the reorganisation, we're still working under old administrative system that do not take account of the reorganisation or the increased standards or commitment required of the reserve. There is an inconsistency between the old regulations and the newly introduced key performance indicators, and this has led to confusion as to what governs reservists and what happens if reservists don't meet their key performance indicators. As a result of the knowledge deficit, permanent units have been forced to make do with the best they can do in the circumstances. Unfortunately, this has resulted in a lack of uniformity of decisions, where unit commanders have varied in relation to clothing issues, equipment, training, recording of hours, development of courses, and limits on paid training. So depending on the unit, reservists have been able to engage in training that was beyond their wildest dreams, and other reservists have suffered through what we would term malicious obedience on the part of middle management, whereby the focus is on key performance indicators, attaining those, and no advancements of reservists' military skills or training. On the issue of recruitment, the administrative instruction identifies for the organisation that a priority for it will be whether it can maintain the level of quality recruitment necessary to staff the organisation for the next 3 to 5 years. The establishment of the Reserve Defence Force went from 9,500 to 4,069. By January 2014, we were already 1,200 under strength. The current strength is 1,734. And in order to meet our establishment by 2016, we need to recruit 2,335 reservists. This represents a figure of over 1,000 reservists a year, which would be a significant task for full-time personnel and absolutely out of reach for part-time professionals. Simply put, the resources are not there to train that number of people in this time period. We will not be able to meet this, and the shortcomings in the previous administration by the permanent staff really belies the fact that the figures on the books never ever reflected what was there in reality. On a positive note, a recruitment campaign was run earlier this year. This was very, very professional. It was run through a combination of national and local media, social media, and a national careers portal. And it was the first time that a campaign for the Reserve Defence Forces was run in this matter. It was very positive, it was very progressive, and it represented an innovative approach to recruitment and through the use of many and varied forms of social media. And it only served to underscore the professionalism expected in the Reserve Defence Force today. The single force concept was reinforced by the fact that there was no difference between the campaign for reservists and the permanent defence forces, and there was no sense of disparity in relation to the value that was attributed to either arm of the defence forces or the value to which it provides to the state. Objective bystanders would have obtained an impression of a young professional combined force which offered many opportunities to the young, willing and able. Nevertheless, there were some disadvantages to the approach. Advertising for both was on the same platform, and this caused confusion. In addition, the application process was through the military website, and all applications were done through the careers section. Now, the Reserve and the Naval Service Reserve have their own dedicated sections of this website, and it would have stood to logical reason that applications for either element should go through that. However, it went through the careers section, which caused confusion for people and the less knowledgeable in respect to the Defence Forces. In addition, service in the Reserve isn't technically a career, so this added to the confusion. And from our research, we know that certain applicants erroneously applied for the Reserve Defence Force when they had actually intended to apply for the Permanent Defence Force. They then went on to progress to the assessment stage of the campaign, and these consisted of a fitness test, interview and medical exam. Again, a positive development in that it demonstrated a professional approach and that only appropriate candidates would be selected for service in the Reserve. It's also usually the first time that these candidates will meet on a face-to-face basis, and it's our belief that when they did so, it projected that they were joining a modern and well-equipped defence force. However, again, issues arose at this stage whereby candidates for the Reserve Defence Force were treated in the same manner to their permanent colleagues. They were given short notice of medical tests and interviews were conducted during the working week, which meant that those in employment had to leave from work to attend. So I'm conscious of the time here. To its credit, the Permanent Defence Force has learned from that as in implementing a new recruitment campaign that has taken in some of our recommendations. Unfortunately, it still doesn't take away from the fact that of the two campaigns run this year, one was flawed and the other won't give us an output for 2015. So we're in a situation where we can't reach our established strength by 2016, and yet we believe, again, this will be pointed to as a failure on the part of the Reserve. We'd like to make it very clear that we embrace the single force concept and its ideals, but this concept cannot be implemented by the Defence Force on its own. It requires a robust and holistic approach based on 4 pillars. In order to have a viable and effective reserve defence force, we need a complete package which involves a shift in government defence policy, legislative underpinning and engagement with employers. This approach will require bravery. It requires the same type of courage that the current Chief of Staff demonstrated in the reorganisation of the Reserve. But now it turns to politicians. We require that courage on the part of people like you in this committee. As it stands, we are being set up to fail. The outcome of the next review is virtually predetermined, and we believe the authors of the Value for Money review have been very clever. They didn't achieve or get their way the last time round, but they've set up a structure in such a way that when the next review comes along, they can sit back, put their hands together and say, "We told you so." And that is sad on a number of different levels. Okay. So, with your indulgence, I'd like to ask Mr. O'Colgan to take some words.
We're way over the 5 minutes, but I want to give you as much flexibility as possible. If colleagues don't mind, Mr. Colgan. Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I addressed this committee in 2013. I thank you for that occasion and that privilege. On that occasion, we were just dealing with the fallout from the Value for Money report, and we took a conscious decision to make a positive and proactive approach to the Value for Money. We were happy that it had come and that we were going to get on with it. We were then, and we are still now, very much committed to making it work. Now, however, I have to take this point to say that, for the record of the Dáil, and conscious this is a public record, that from the Naval Service Reserve point of view, the general feeling is that for us, the Value for Money report was an odious document, which was reverse engineered to arrive at a predetermined conclusion that the RDF, both the Army Reserve and the Naval Reserve, were all a bad lot and all had to be got rid of. What Naval Service Reserve personnel found particularly galling was that the efforts and successes of the Naval Service Reserve had been whitewashed out. No naval officer was on that Value for Money report board, and therefore the department, we feel, took the chance to airbrush the NSR success out of that report. And you may ask, well, why on earth would they do that? Simple. The Naval Service Reserve was the inconvenient truth that the professional military organisation, the Navy, could in fact use its reserve in an effective manner for the benefit of both themselves and for the general public. Therefore, if you did have the time to go back and read that report, you would find that there's actually far more reference and discussions on the Garda Reserve than there is on the Naval Service Reserve. The net result of the Value for Money report, from our point of view, was that we were slashed from establishment of 400 to 200. This despite the fact that we live on an island in the Atlantic with a coastline of 7,800 kilometres. 200 personnel between our 4 units left us with 50 personnel for each unit, and a long list of key performance indicators to be achieved. We feel that we've been set up to fail. So, what has been the actual Naval Service Reserve experience of the single force concept? Well, in practice, it's been a lot of paperwork and very little in the way of actual support regarding increased training or equipment. The truth is that the single force concept of trying to merge the PDF and the RDF into a seamless unit is a bit like trying to merge the HSE and Ryanair. It's going to take an awful long time. There's going to have to be an awful lot of mind changes to both sides. I emphasise both sides here, not just the RDF. In fact, a single force concept, were it to be properly executed in all its aims and goals, it would be far more traumatic to the PDF than ourselves. At the moment, the land-based element of the Naval Service operate like the Army. That is to say, it operates within a circular or bubble world of within the naval base. Monday to Friday, 9 to 4:30. The Navy, just like the Army, has become very good at wrapping itself in its own self-imposed regulations and paperwork. Their concept of single force concept is that we operate exactly like they do. They have made no compromise in the way they operate to incorporate us. To give a perfect example of this, we were told in early 2013 that just like the Naval Service, the NSR must use a document called the Manual of Staff Duties when planning and applying for anything. The Manual of Staff Duties was hand-typed in 1980. So we are to operate to a 34-year-old hand-typed document, which of course cannot be removed from the barracks. I'm just going to give 3 very brief examples of the other kind of non-compromising procedures and bureaucracy that the NSR have to contend with in our battle to try and make the single force concept successful. First one is NSR units, as same as Army Reserve units, are meant to be self-administrating. So a prerequisite for the MIF course, which is a course pertaining to logistics and things like that, computer system that is having an ECDL, European Computers Driver's License. To do an ECDL in the Defence Forces, you can do it through the Defence Forces. It only takes a mere 4 weeks of solid full-time training. If you were to do it in the civilian world, it would take 10 hours in various evening courses. Second example is fitness test. As Martin alluded to, we had a recruitment campaign and the fitness tests are now the exact same as the PDF, and that is to be welcomed. However, in our particular example down in our unit, the Naval Service ran the fitness test in the middle of a day of a Tuesday and a Wednesday. So when the new recruits who wanted to join the Naval Service Reserve were asked to come up for a fitness test in Limerick, they were asked to come up in the middle day of Tuesday and Wednesday. No consideration was given to the fact that these are part-timers, that we have jobs and we have courses and we are students. So they have, in fairness to them, learned from that position, and now they're going to run the fitness test at the weekend. But already they're kind of proposed that the course be run down in the naval base, which means people from Limerick and Waterford have to travel to the naval base. We just asked, why couldn't they just come up to us? The third and final example of what goes on is the eyesight standards. By a bureaucratic anomaly, the Naval Service Reserve must now have a higher eyesight standard than any other branch of Defence Forces, that is Army, Air Corps, Army Reserve and even the Naval Service themselves. When we proposed a solution to get over this anomaly, the Naval Service looked at our proposal, said thank you very much, it was very interesting reading, and then they responded with a half-page email with 9 references to our proposals being either impossible, not currently possible, or very difficult. You may have thought we were trying to land the man on the moon. So those are just 3 examples of kind of what we are running into. This non-compromising paperwork and bureaucracy is being very successfully used, we feel, to waste time. The changes called for in the value for money are not getting made. The full list of key performance indicators are not getting met. There's been no pre-planning with us to discuss what changes have to be done, and despite several requests from our side of the fence. So, to summarise finally, what is our fear? Our fear is this, that the value for money review, which is set for 2016, we feel that that has been set up for exactly the same time as their election, after the election 2016, when there will be a new Minister for Defence. Sometime after the Easter commemorations, the Department of Defence will drop a review report on the new Minister's desk and say, look, there you go, Minister, we gave them a chance, and so they couldn't do it. Time to disband them. As the Taoiseach himself recently said, the civil service are the best people in the world to write a 300-page report on why things can't get done. What we in NSR want and need is a far more positive, flexible and accommodating response from the Naval Service, the Army and the Department of Defence, if we are to be allowed to get to where we need to get to. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All done? Long 5 minutes. I just want to obviously say that I'm a former member of the FCA as it was then, just in case there's any conflict of interest being put out there. Deputy RDFRA, you wanted to ask some questions, please.
Yeah, I'll be brief, Chairman, because there's a critical section of the Dáil, as we all know, underway at present. And I want to thank you, Chairman, for having facilitated this meeting today, because I think it is very important, and the committee in agreeing to invite in the representative body is to be lauded on its actions. I think the sort of time that's available to us today, given the date that's in it, will not allow perhaps for the type of in-depth discussion that we need to have. And I'd like to ask, Chair, that maybe over the next couple of weeks, but no later, that we reserve time here for the committee to engage constructively on the points that have been brought to our attention today. Now, when the Reserve Defence Force representatives came before us in April of last year, it's probably true to say that some people felt that they were being perhaps a little alarmist. They're here a year and a half on, and there's a sense of fatalism in what they're saying to us. I had a whole lot of questions I wanted to put, but I think what really is needed in this situation is an affirmation on the part of the committee of a recognition of the importance of the Reserve Defence Forces. That the reserves are a critical part of the whole defence structure that we have on this island. And I think we have got to see it against a situation in which we have pared back our permanent defence forces to 9,500 members. We have the lowest expenditure among neutral countries as a percentage of GDP in the European Union. And we see our RDF now operating at way below their establishment strength. So they're asking us, I think, to conduct a review. I'd have one question in that respect. I wonder, are they asking us as a committee to conduct the review ourselves, or do they feel that we should secure outside expertise to do that review on our behalf? But can I say, and I think I speak for all members on all sides of the House, that there is a recognition among the body politic of the importance of reservists, and that if it is your sense that you've been set up by faceless bureaucrats within a system, the purpose of which is to make you fail, well then that's not our ambition for you, and our ambition is to see you realise your full potential. And I think, Chairman, that this committee should and will do everything in its power to work with the reservists to ensure that the sort of priority that they deserve is given to them into the future.
You have no specific questions at this stage, Deputy Free.
Other than how they feel we should undertake the review that they refer to.
Okay, yeah. Interesting points. You do mention, and I'll bring other members in a moment, you do mention, Chair, 4 things here. One, you mentioned a legislative underpinning, and it might be useful to be more specific on that at some stage, maybe not now, but maybe if we forward on what you mean specifically by that. You also mention meaningful engagement with employers. Again, that's very broad and very non-specific.
If I may take that point there.
Yeah, just before I'd just like to let Deputy Kenny in first, and then we'll come back to you on that, if we may. Deputy Kenny.
Thanks, Cathaoirleach. And really, I'm standing in for my colleague, Senator Dennis Landy, who can't be here today. In fact, he's ill. I think he was in the Reserve Defence Forces, the FCA himself, for a considerable length of time, and I'm really here representing him. I mean, I understand what you're saying, that your numbers have dropped down to 1734 from 4,000 or 5,000. That's a fairly drastic reduction. I also take your point in relation to the comparison with the Garda Reserve, where that they have, there is agreements between their employers and the Gardaí Síochána that they will be released and that there won't be any adverse consequences on their careers if they join, and that doesn't exist for the Reserve Defence Force. I think that is something that I think we could take up to see if it can be done by legislative underpinning, or whether the Minister can do it by regulation, or whether it needs some kind of employment regulation. I'm not quite sure, but I think it is an important fact, that somebody shouldn't have to suffer for, voluntarily, engaging with the Defence Forces and playing their part in serving their country, that they should be given employment guarantees in that regard.
Okay. Anyone else want to come in on that? Okay. Sorry?
Chair, I have a few questions later on, if you want to.
Okay. Do anybody want to respond to what the Deputy is saying?
Just on the employment issue there, when we made a comparison to the Garda Reserve, when a Reserve Garda is in regular employment, a service level agreement will be drawn up between the Garda Síochána and the employer in question. This will include an information pack for the employer from on Garda Síochána. We don't have anything like that whatsoever. You're on your own, except you're in a civil service job or a public service job. So on the employment matter, we would look for something similar to that. It's not amending any legislation at this point in time, or bringing forward new legislation. And what we would say is that if we could get an amendment or an insert to other legislation, such as the equality legislation, in that a reservist could not be discriminated against because of his membership of the reserve. Something like that might satisfy the legislators, rather than bringing in a whole raft of new legislation.
Okay. Okay. Right. Deputy McGrath?
Yeah, well, just a couple of points, Chair. First of all, I want to welcome you and thank you for your excellent submission. And I'd like to agree with my colleague, Deputy Sean O'Farrell, there, that we do value the Reserve Defence Forces, and we do recognise it right across all the political parties in relation to the thing. But when we're just get down to the nuts and bolts of this debate, I mean, we're talking about value for money here. Now, initially, when I listened to that word, of course, we have to be responsible and we're spending taxpayers' money in relation to the Defence Forces Association. But I mean, as far as I'm concerned, in my Reserve Defence Forces, I want commitment and I want dedication to the job. That would be my first value. That would be my first priority, and I think that's what the state should look for. But just my first question, so in relation to that, is that you talked in your submission there about you have to recruit 2,335 reservists by 2016, and you're saying that's it's a very difficult target to reach. That's next year, we'll say a year and a half. Why do you say that? Well, why is it going to be so difficult? Yeah.
Mr. Coney, yeah.
So the reason why it's difficult is if we look at any recruitment campaign, say the last one that happened in earlier this year, I think the upshot of the entire campaign is that for the formation, say in the DFTC, you get a recruit platoon. I'm not sure the exact numbers, but you're looking at generally getting maybe 50 people for that formation, and then there's 3 formations. Now the current campaign, which is going on again in the DFTC, I think there's 80 applicants at present for that. And in general, our figures show that for any one successful applicant, or for any one successful recruit, you need 4 applicants. So if you were to recruit just on a statistical level, you would need, for 1,000 successful applicants, you'd need 4,000 applications. That being said, if you got the interest, there aren't the resources there to train it. You need people there on the ground to train reservists. And to train 1,000 people, I would challenge any semi-state body or government or state body to recruit 1,000 people in a year, where they have to have the people undergo medicals, undergo security checks, which can take anything from 6 weeks to 12 weeks, and to undergo interviews and to undergo the whole process. So you've got logistical issues with training that amount of people, whereby you're trying to bring up part-time personnel on their spare time, using up their annual leave, which is very precious. You've got a permanent force, which is under huge pressures since their reorganisation, and you've got the issues of all the administrative criteria, and let alone to the sheer numbers. It's massive.
Okay. So that actually leads on to my second question, because so basically you're saying you're indicating there's a huge cost issue. And then my next question I was going to ask is the overall cost of the reserved defence forces. What is the current figure there, approximate cost in relation to, and also the cost effectiveness of it?
The current allocation for the reserve defence forces on direct payment is 1.3 million. That equates to 0.29% of the complete defence budget. And we had originally, in 2013, had an allocation of 1.3 million. Sorry, 2.3.
2.3 million.
Yeah, and that was reduced and has been reducing every year since 2009 dramatically. We also had an allocation of 41,000 man days, and that number of man days was slashed to 28,000 last year. So we now have a situation where the resource allocation that we have to work within is 1.3 million, and the man day allocation that we have is 28,000. So, as my colleague was saying, if we could recruit, we're prohibited because the resource allocation is not there and the man day allocation is not there. So we're actually after being painted into a corner whereby we have no control over this whatsoever. That's the allocation we got. And if that doesn't go up pro rata as people come in, we can't reach the 4,000. In fact, it's simple arithmetic. 4,000 people by 7 days is 41,000 man days. So therefore, if they're after restricting us, which they are, we cannot perform and we cannot meet the KPIs as was mentioned earlier. We can't meet the unit KPIs because the people haven't got the allocation to train.
So the current cost in 2014 is 1.3 million to the taxpayer.
In direct payments to the RDF.
Yeah, that's the figure I'm looking for.
Yeah.
And why did I get the impression that maybe as a layperson here now, that figure is way lower than I thought?
Well, the VFM set out to take the overall costs of running and administering the RDF.
Yeah.
And they came up with a figure in the VFM which we as an organisation would seriously dispute, in that it was 21 to 22 million euros. Now, the RDF suffered a straight line graph on its membership, downward straight line graph on its membership since 2009, because in 2009 the restrictions came into place. The precursor to the restrictions was in 2008, a recruitment campaign which was sanctioned by the Minister was cancelled permanently. And in 2009, the recruiting restrictions came into place and we weren't allowed to recruit more than 400 people. Even though it says in the VFM, we were losing 1,400 people per annum at that stage, and they take account of that in the VFM, but there's contradictory statements in the VFM. So therefore, if we had the number of people maintained, we would then have an RDF today that could be stood up, if you like, at 4,000. Now the 4,000 allocation for the RDF has never come into being because, as my colleague pointed out earlier, in January of 2014 we had 1,200 vacancies in the RDF and still there was attrition going on. And one of the things that worked against us in a very sad way really is that people who were in the RDF up to the reorg in Galway were transferred to Cork. People who were in the RDF in Athlone were transferred to Dublin. People who were in the RDF in Dublin were transferred to Athlone. So they were discommoded intentionally, is the only way that we'd see it. So therefore we lost all of those people. In addition, they managed people out because we were all given a document in March of 2013 where we had to tick a box whether we wanted to go to a new unit, whether we wanted to stay with the old unit in the place it was, or whether we wanted to be discharged. And a lot of people were managed out that way. So our numbers fell dramatically, but the costs incurred didn't go down at all, and that's why the 21 million. The Minister, in a statement earlier in 2013, stated that there was going to be a 50% reduction in the RDF, thereby generating a saving of 11 million. But it's only a paper saving, because the same people are still in the PDF that were put down for having the cost factor incurred of the 11 million. So that saving isn't true. But the saving on the RDF, in 2008, we cost 7.9 million, and in 2014, we're costing 1.3.
Okay, and just can I raise, is it okay?
Sure, of course.
Yeah, Chairman, yeah. Just in relation to the debate there about the reservists may be required to take up to 4 days annual leave in order to meet simple admin requirements, and then you talked about using up 60% of their annual statutory annual leave. There's two things there. I presume one, it's like from the management point of view, it's obviously a way for them to try and save some money. That's number one. But is there another agenda there? Is there a test there to test the commitment of your members, to make it awkward, to see could they have people that would really take a bad hit in order to be members of the Reserve Defence Forces?
And as a preliminary point to that, I would say there's no saving whether they run it during the day or at night, because these people who administer the tests are paid a salary and their appointment is 24/7. So if they're dictated to turn up at 8 o'clock or 2000 hours in the evening, they have to turn up for reservists. The sunk costs in relation to the structure and the establishment are there, the administration is there, so there is absolutely no saving whatsoever if you use the Defence Force to administer these tests in just changing them to be flexible. As I said, the permanent Defence Force gets no further incentive or pay for doing so. I think there are lots of issues with this. My colleague James Scanlon can allude to some of them.
Thank you, Chairman. What I would just like to cover very briefly is the idea of KPIs. They're broken down into individual and unit.
KPIs are now
key performance indicators, targets, rather. Thank you, Chairman.
That's fine.
Basically, if you just look at the individual KPIs, which are the most important, they'd be broken down into a medical, a fitness test, a weapons test, and your attendance over the year. So that is the shortest way of looking at it. Now, the main problem we're having at the moment is with medicals. And you might say, okay, that's only a quarter of your target, so what's your problem? The problem is that the medical has a knock-on effect into the other areas. You can't complete your fitness test unless you do a medical first. Do you understand? They're looking at next year that you won't be able to do, they're bringing in a new personal weapons test, and that personal weapons test will be dependent on the person having passed the medical and a fitness test before they do it. It's quite a strenuous test. So at the moment, we're being starved of the medical. Now, we assumed that a new medical would be introduced for the reserve, okay, a less stringent medical, because I went for a medical recently. There was an ECG, there was blood tests, I was offered vaccinations. It's overkill for a reservist, okay? And they can say that there can only be one standard, but already there are different standards. And, for instance, in your fitness test, if you're a member of the Air Corps or a member of the Naval Service, you don't have to complete Part 3 of your fitness test. So that, there isn't just one standard even for the PDF. Standards can be tailored to the commitment or what's necessary. We obviously don't want anybody falling over during and dying during their fitness test, but really, do we need to put the taxpayer to the cost involved in running these very detailed medicals for reservists? Some of our suggestions in this regard is that maybe the medical examination could be provided at the weekends by the Defence Forces. Could the reservist GP provide a medical for the Defence Forces for a set fee? And that would allow the reservists to attend their GP at a time of their own choosing, whether it be a weekend or an evening. We have RDF doctors who could possibly be activated to help the resources available to conduct medicals. Perhaps the same medical, but less frequently, maybe every 3 years instead of annually, and then you could self-certify on the other years. Or in the Canadian Defence Forces, they have different frequency and intensity of medicals depending on the type of service that the person is engaged in. But the reason we're harping on this medical target is it is influencing all the other targets. And we are afraid, we've been given verbal assurances by the general staff that we will not be held to these KPIs because they are not providing the resources to us. But these assurances are verbal. These people may be retired by the time a review comes around, and the review will consist of looking back at the targets and assessing whether we met them or not. And we would ask that the Defence Forces would look at a flexible method of allowing us to achieve these medicals, and then the other KPIs flow from those. And we have no doubt that members of the RDF are capable of meeting all these targets.
Mr. Cooney,
I might address Deputy McGrath. You also asked, and very astutely so, you asked, is this a method of testing the commitment of a reservist? I think it most definitely is so. I think it would test the commitment of anyone whereby I have 26 days annual leave a year and I'm using up 5 on administrative tasks, and I'm testing the patience of my employer if I ask their indulgence. I'm testing the patience of my other half who's saying, well, we can't actually get a holiday away together this year because you did a career course and you did your administrative key performance indicators, and your week over Christmas is gone. So when are you going to bring me and the kids on holidays? I think it's a huge test of your commitment to any organisation.
And is there no flexibility from the employers? No.
There is, but it depends on the goodwill of your employer. If your employer is inclined to release you, but the issue is your employer pays you to do a job, and I can turn up for my part one of my medical in a medical place, and I can, or in a medical establishment, and I can be told that the doctor isn't here until 2 o'clock, so you'll have to come back at 2 o'clock. Now, if I have to travel as I do 50 kilometres, that incurs the guts of an hour driving there, so I'm not going to go back to my employer. We had a guy yesterday who turned up, had taken the day off work, and was told that he wouldn't be seen at all. So, you know, your employer can only have so much patience, and they're paying you to do a job, not to sit in the Defence Forces medical establishment.
Okay, thank you. All done, Deputy McGrath?
Just to wrap up too, you mentioned there, Martin, as I just want to have you, the deficiencies in the records and administration associated with the Reserve Defence Forces. What kind of deficiencies were you talking about there?
I'll give you a personal example in a second, but what we found is when they went through the books, the figures in the books, you had people who were dead, you had people who were in Australia, you had people who were in the Defence Forces, you had people in Canada, you had people who had resigned. In my own instance, I applied for a position. My position was confirmed. 6 months later, I got a letter appointing me to another position, completely ignoring the fact that I was already serving in one unit for 3 or 4 months. And it took me a further 12 months before I was on the computer record system of my unit, so they couldn't record anything to do with me in relation to training. And I had the other unit ringing me up and telling me why wasn't I turning up for training, despite the fact that I had over 100 hours voluntary training. So those are the kind of issues we've experienced.
A lot of administrative stuff that needs to be tidied up. All done?
And just a kind of a broader final question, sorry Chairman, I have to drive you bananas, but I just think it's important. But a key thing there that jumped to me as well as your submission, which I feel very uncomfortable about, because I would be very supportive of the Reserve Defence Forces. And again, I want to thank you for commitment. Is this whole idea of structural conflict between the current Defence Forces and the Reserve Defence Force? As a taxpayer and as somebody, I see it as our Defence Forces. And I just don't like to see that happen in our organisation. You're part of our team. You represent the state. We're all very proud of you. We do appreciate the commitment, the time, the effort you put in. But I don't like the structural conflict between yourselves and the mainstream.
All right. Deputy Phelan, you want to come in?
Thanks, Chairman. And I welcome the presentation. Like, there's a fairly strong, no holds barred effort. I must confess I have no family or other involvement in the Reserve Defence Forces, and most of what I've heard today, in fact virtually all of it, is new to me. I have some sympathy with Mr. Cooney's point in relation to stresses at home in terms of time. You should try politics sometime. We can all empathise with that.
It's a bit like being a counsellor, actually. Time off.
I want to get some clarification on a couple of the points that were made in relation to the numbers. You say 1,700 at present. Does that include the numbers that were, you say, I think it was 40 recruited at the start of this year? Does that include that figure?
No, it wouldn't. That was, I think, it was, yeah, those who were paid this year, so it doesn't.
You also mentioned 9,500 as was that a historic kind of figure for the reserve? The old FCA will say that there was 9,500 people, and the other reserves, or where did that? I missed the connection of that figure to
the organisation of 2005. The figure was 9,500.
Okay.
And that figure pertained up to and including the 20th of November 2012, when this reorganisation came out.
Okay.
We're after having a reorganisation in '99. We had a reorganisation in 2005, and we have a third reorganisation in 2012.
Okay.
And each of those reorganisations have vastly reduced the numbers, and we're down to 4,000 now of an establishment. And the 1,734 figure was those who attended paid training in the last 12 months.
I also wanted to ask in relation to, like, there would be a perception, at least, maybe you can disabuse me of this if it's not correct, that there is a significant turnover in terms of people who become involved, maybe if they're younger and have less commitments, to go back to Mr. Cooney's earlier point, and that they leave. Maybe you could refer to that.
Well, I suppose the reorganisation itself demonstrated that that's not true, because we had a situation whereby we were coming down to 4,000 of a nominal figure, and they had to manage people out. So therefore, we were oversubscribed for the 4,000. So therefore, the number of people who they would attribute to a large turnover, there is a large turnover in the first year, as there is in any organisation. People come in and they go, and that's basically it. But we don't suffer large turnovers. We suffer good retention, and even in their own figures in the VFM, in the years leading up to 2012, we had 87% and we had 76% attendance. So that speaks for itself.
So people who become involved tend to stay involved. The other question, again, relates to Mr. Cooney's, and this is my last one. You said that the management structure, following on from the reorganisation, like we're 20-something months into it now, and it's still, the new structure hasn't really been put into operation. I mean, is there any indication as to when or if, or, is that happening? Are we likely to see that new structure anytime soon?
Mr. Cooney, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's happening slowly but surely, and undoubtedly the general staff are committed to this, and they've given us full support and have always at all times been supportive of us and met us when we've requested it. I think our issue here is middle management, and the issue is that the message comes down the line to middle management and then stops. So that the people who are actually dealing with you either have a lack of information or a lack of training, or actually don't know what's going on. I think as well, with the speed that happened with the reorganisation, like if you think about it, the value for money review happened in November. The administrative order was formalised at the beginning of February, and we were to be reorganised by March. Is a significant speed for such a large organisation spread geographically all over the country. So I think whilst the administrative order was out within weeks at the draft, the actual admin following on wasn't up to speed. So the general regulation governing the entire reserve has not been brought up to date. But I understand that a draft is near completion and is near sign-off, so that will happen. But it's a little bit late halfway through the process to the next review.
Your middle management issues sound like politics again.
We could swap roles.
Okay, all done?
Yes.
Okay, all right. Just one or two points here. I mentioned already, you talk about a shift in government defence policy, which is something we need to talk about ourselves in the committee. Legislative underpinning, if you have some concrete suggestions, discrete suggestions, that you might send it on to us, and also a meaningful engagement with employers. So the employer, there are a number of employer bodies, and then there are the single traders as well. So, I mean, that's kind of an interesting one, and I'm not sure whether or not employers or employer organisations have commented on this already to you. Whether you have any engagement yourselves with any employer organisations, have you? Have you had? Mr. Mully?
No, not up to this point in time. We were looking to make some connections there with IBEC, all right?
Yes, okay.
And we haven't done those at the moment because we were coming here first.
Okay. The other issue here, of course, is the old chestnut, defined operational roles. Now, that's there as long as I'm aware of the reserve, and there still isn't a defined operational role to my knowledge.
Well, the last time we were in with your chair, I did mention in that briefing that they were at that point talking about in aid to the civil authority. That hasn't been advanced because, as my colleague Martin pointed out, the defence, if you like, legislation has not been updated. We're still waiting on the R5 to be published, and they have moved on one point in that we will be allowed to do under the draft amendment to the R5 duties, which was raised at the last one as well. So we're waiting for the changes to take place to see what will come out of that.
Okay.
Chair,
yes, Mr. Cooney.
Colleague Robert Gilby has actually done some study on employer engagement in other jurisdictions. If you'd like to hear maybe a minute from him.
Very briefly, because we're really up against time now at this stage.
Right. Basically, I did a lot of study on international comparison, particularly the four countries that the Value for Money report looked at, which were Canada, the UK, Australia, and New Zealand. I'll keep it as brief as I can, but basically there were four sort of key fundamentals that all their reserve forces have that we don't, and that were pretty much glossed over in the Value for Money report. The first being operational purpose, which we've just discussed here, which is absolutely pivotal. We need that in order to orientate recruitment and training around. Secondly is employment protection legislation, because this is a key enabler, and it's a mission critical piece of legislation that's standard among all our international comparators. We've mentioned as well that it was present before in the Section 57 of the 1940 Defence Forces Act, but it's no longer there. And we'd hope that employment protection legislation is going to be discussed comprehensively in the white paper coming up, because it certainly wasn't in the Value for Money. If a reservist doesn't have any guarantee of that their livelihood is safe, then there's no guarantee that we can actually mobilise them. So it really is a matter of courtesy protecting reservists who are themselves protecting Ireland. But legislation alone doesn't work. There has to be employer support and engagement. It's not enough to oblige employers to release reservists for mobilisation and possibly training. There has to be engagement between defence and employers. Now, this is generally done among all our comparative nations through consultative bodies that bridge the gap between defence and industry. Such a group was recommended in a military board report in 1999, but to our detriment, this was never actually pursued. And again, perhaps the white paper might address this. It's important that employers understand that there are significant business benefits to employing reservists. You know, there are practical skills that we learn, there are personality traits that are developed, and qualifications that reservists can bring back from their reserve service that have scalable value. And actually, this scalable value has actually been published in the Sabre reports, who used the Institute of, Sabre, the group, consultative body that the UK use, have actually published reports themselves using the Chartered Management Institute to scale the cost attributed to reserve training, to present that to employers, to just show how much that training is worth. Now, employers in other nations are also rewarded for supporting and hiring reservists, and in Australia, for example, employers can claim up to $1,400 a week through an employer support payment scheme if they release their reservists for training and deployment. And as well, such is the importance of supporting the employers, that there is even an international conference on employer supports for reservists that is held biannually. This is used to discuss research and experience in order to enhance reserve capability although to date Ireland hasn't actually participated in this conference, and again we'd like to hope that going forward we can actually look at this. As well, in order to get the most out of your reserve, all our reserves as well are classified as, our comparative reserves in the international context, all their reserves are classified as part-time employees. You know, the Reserve Defence Force itself prides itself on being a volunteer force. Unfortunately, though, the removal of annual gratuity and the policy of measured compulsory volunteerism has led to poor retention, and that will explain why we have such a deficit in the low-level ranks at the minute.
Okay. Yeah, Mr. Cooney.
I think the very fundamental point is this isn't something new. It's been done in other jurisdictions. They have employer engagement agencies, and in order to deal with all the employer agencies, we require a specific employer engagement agency to do so.
Okay, interesting. Okay. All right, then I think we've done. Mr. Richardson, do you want to say anything at this stage or contribute anything?
If I could only add briefly, Mr. Chairman, addition to the point Mr. Rob Gilding made there about SABRE and the employment engagement programme that the British Armed Forces have. They did a recent survey, actually a series of surveys, regarding various promotions courses within their reserve military and putting an actual financial value on it to employers. And for example, they found that to put a person through their recruit training, so the lowest level of training that the British Reserve Forces offered, was worth £960 to a civilian employer. To train a person to be a reserve officer was worth £22,000 sterling to a civilian employer. So they have actually put financial values on it to employers, giving them, I suppose, employer incentives and changing the kind of perception that the Reserve Forces would have in the UK. If that was done here as well, and employers were to, I suppose, look on employing Reserve Defence Forces personnel as an actual benefit to their companies, that would be something we would like to see as well.
Interesting. Okay. All right. I think we're done at that stage. So I want to thank you very much for your submission, and I invite you to possibly keep engaged with us. There are a number of questions that were put to you, and I think you might reflect on those. Maybe come back to us with maybe some more detail on the questions that we put there. A number of us put to you. And I also want to acknowledge other members in the public gallery as well, other people who've come here today. I'm sure involved and interested in this. So we'll now take a short break, and we'll go into private session to deal with some housekeeping stuff. Thank you.